But I think it's a nice continuation of discussion that we had with the last session. I think it's a great moment for us to be all together here to discuss about this. Someone said parallel world, converging worlds, and I think there is a lot of points in which we could make this conversation a converging conversation, and this I mean it's nothing new to talk about. We in terms of conservation, this is what we have been doing for many years now. But how I feel as a material scientist and as a representation of this last session and supporter of the ideas that were presented in the last session, I think we do have a great opportunity to make a strong contribution. I said that in my first panel, and I'm keep saying this in this conclusion remarks, also supported by evidence of what you have seen in these presentations. We are really able to contribute in a I believe much better way to this conversation, and try to really bring all this conversation to the next level. And in my opinion, next level definitely leads to an construction of multidimensional space in which each of us is able to contribute, and we process that space from many different perspectives into a complex data kind of a space, but still able to converge that information into a result that would guide us in making these difficult decisions that each of us has to make. So to make it simple, I know that this is kind of abstract way of presenting it, but still I think there is a potential to handle now, even in this digital world, that data set that we could build from each of our different perspectives and come with the new answers, new strategies, and I believe next level of understanding active matter, and how this active matter can brings us to a better decision making when it comes to conservation, but also to a general way of projecting our work into the future. And of course, as a MIT, I like to think about future and how this information can be used to inspire next generation of conservators, but also next generation of engineers producing new materials and building new solutions that will lead next the future.
Next millennium.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Correct. 21st century.
Well, I started out this morning wondering if by the end of the day I will have regretted everything I said last night, having learned so much from philosophers and historians and people concerned with indigenous ontologies, as well as material scientists. And I'm happy to say that I don't regret what I said last night. Just as a reminder, I started out questioning what active matter meant, and that's what we've been discussing all day. It means many things to many people. I focused on physical changes in cellulose nitrate, concerns with Nam-June Paik television sets that are no longer functioning, so very material questions that conservators address. And I mentioned programmable materials, smart materials, but I then went to the social, which I always do. I just firmly believe that these objects that we are passing down through history only have meaning if people engage with them and find meaning from them. I mentioned that constellations of people come together to make decisions about these objects. Conservators manage change, that's what we do, and that it's a creative process, that people from different professional backgrounds do their research, come together, negotiate decisions. Those decisions are going to be different in different contexts, at different places, different times. And I think that is just the way it goes. I'd like to add a few things. One is that I usually mention the importance of bringing non-professional stakeholders into the process as well. So I'm very glad that I was reminded in the session of Indigenous Ontologies that it's important to not just bring these professionals together, but also think more widely about meaning invested in these objects and open the discussion up to others who might be, who might have associations with these objects, artists, indigenous representatives, and the broader public. So it's important, I think, to just keep that focus of the relationship of objects to humans as we move forward. In reflecting on the organization of this project, one of the concerns I had was how come there's not a conservation group? There's material scientists, there are, all four groups. But I did witness conservators being part of some of the groups, and I just hope that if, in the end, the goal of this project, or one of the goals of the project, is to inform conservation or conservators, or at least move the way they research and practice forward, maybe in a more intellectual capacity, to make sure that conservators are involved in the process, and to really think about how, in the end, this 5-year project will impact conservators at the bench, conservators doing research. Yeah, please keep that in mind. But it's a very, very exciting project, and I look forward to watching it develop over the next 5 years.
Well, thank you. I feel a lot of the same things as the other speakers have already brought up. I've learned an unbelievable amount. One thing that sort of sticks in my mind is the thought of something that hasn't much been spoken about. A sort of connecting thread that's come through this is the idea of objects as aging, and the question of how, in different ways, different stakeholders, as someone said, manage change. And I'm interested in the imagery here of a stakeholder, management, in a way, I think, in larger terms of control here. This is, what we're dealing with is a particular variety of giving up control, or rather accepting a kind of limitation of control in the face of changing time. And that makes me think of perhaps a larger question that this debate could insert itself in if it wished to. That's a debate about political economy, and the political economy of the ownership, the management, the law surrounding artworks. It seems to me that it's just obvious that people spend, a lot of people will be much motivated to preserve, and I use deliberately a word that most people have been avoiding, artworks when they're worth tens of millions of dollars, and they rather think that they might be conceivably selling them at some point. The value of the artworks in the first place is very much dependent, among other things, on the larger political context in which people get tax deductions on such a scale and over such a construction that it can end up costing people effectively nothing to buy these things, to bid for them, and then donate them. Now, it strikes me as interesting that in the field of music, not very long ago, things were rather different. I mean, Wagner could write Tristan, and Chabrier could come along and write Souvenir de whatever it is, Munich, I think it is. And it's a parody of Wagnerian musical themes, and it's a great piece of fun. Now, today you can't simply take a piece of somebody else's work and make fun of it. You've, ownership of that work, the rights over it resides with somebody else. You have to, either you ask permission or you pay your money, I suppose, if you get challenged in the end. So, question is, I mean, let me see, you receive a work of art, you can't simply transform it in any old way now. We're thinking about our role as, in different ways, either commentators upon or agents of a kind of stewardship. But I would like to see some discussion of the larger context that this is placed within, and the thought that works of art are to be stewarded. Well, of course we want, so to speak, always the historical record to be stewarded, but in another way at another time people created works of art and they did get transformed, reused, and so on. And right now there are very substantial constraints on that in respect of ownership and law. I'm thinking of ownership, among other things, of reputation and of, so to speak, artistic rights over the thing. And the question of how much one might think that, well, in the face of changing time, we have to accept that things are going to go out of existence. There's a question how much we think that it's simply given that objects made qua art are to be decided upon, for example, 100% by the artist, or maybe 100% by the museum or private owner who might have them, or whatever mix it might be. And, well, how about any other stakeholders we might like to consider? Or how about moving away from a stakeholder model to some kind of, you just hand this out into the world and maybe people who make things just get a guaranteed income? It's another wild idea that people throw out. And there are many different ways that one could think about the insertion of these debates into a larger political economy of our world. Thank you.
Thank you all for your comments and reflections. Is there anybody who wants to respond to anything that they've said before we ideally open this up, hog wild, ask each other questions?
I'd like to pursue the question of the social meaning and the social uses of artifacts. One of the things that I toyed with when I was putting together my remarks is the observation that among the very active things is not just matter, but the meaning that we ascribe to matter. And that has been, of course, notoriously in the news recently in this country with the question of what one does with various kinds of monuments to or about the Confederacy. But there was one piece in particular that struck my imagination and as unexpected, I guess, and that is, perhaps some of you have seen it, when Yale Sterling Library was rehabbed recently, the new entrance was monkeyed with in a way that I found very troubling. It originally showed on one of the pillars in some sort of stone or cast materials, I couldn't tell because I only saw a photo, showed a pilgrim pointing a musket at an Indian who had a bow. Is anybody familiar with this? And when they when they rehabbed the building, they took a sort of concrete material and plastered over the musket. So it now looks like pals, Indian and pilgrim holding up the Sterling Library. A major change of meaning that was described as an attempt or as a vow to not offending people. But I'm not sure not offending people is as important as recording the moment when that appeared to be an appropriate thing to have there. You've seen it, so perhaps...
I've seen it. I've seen it.
Actually,
sorry, listen.
I wondered how people had responded to it, because I only read a small article.
Well, it's been removed from the building, and it's now in conservation, and they're removing that block of concrete that was placed over it. What its ultimate fate is, I don't know. My guess would be not to go back on the building. It will be preserved in one of the Yale collections, but they are taking away that sort of crude, and it was an amazingly crude, if you can imagine just getting some concrete and putting it in a ball and then slapping it in the middle, that's effectively what happened to it. So it's being treated, that's being removed, and yeah, I don't know what its ultimate fate is.
I'd like to respond or add to it a little bit. I like to think of objects as having physical and social lives, and in terms of their social life, they are born with meanings, and meaning is layered onto them, multiple meanings over time and place. And the conservation moment in an object's life is often a moment that can be used to engage people in establishing new meaning, renegotiating meaning, bringing multiple people to the table to just even have a conversation about that meaning. So I think there's social benefits to conservation way beyond the material benefits of the interventions that we as conservators do. And yeah, I'd just like to make a plug for that as we think about active matter, to always think about the human dimension and ask, who are we serving by the interventions that we do, and who's at the table, so who's empowered to even make these decisions about, in the end, the narratives that we're creating through objects about the past.
Peter.
Yeah, apologies for what's left of my voice. So these are really questions for the group to think about. We talked a lot in our discussions about change. Talked a lot about art objects. We talked much less about, let's say, cultural heritage objects or objects of daily life. And I wonder, just for the group, do we need to think about that nomenclature, because is it loaded? Does it move the direction of our conversation about active matter and its conservation in one particular direction or another? That's one general question. The other, it's something that came up during Sherry's talk, where we kind of decide whether something is an unacceptable loss or an acceptable loss based on time. And Mark picked up this question of, we haven't talked about time a lot, and it may be the case, this is the question to the group, is time really a much more essential component to this larger project, both on the how do we measure activity side and how do we measure conservation on both sides? Do we need to have more thinking about time plugged in to this project as it rolls forward? Those are my two questions to the group.
And Sophie, do you wanna?
No.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Something to Peter
Mhm.
about the certain classes of objects, art objects versus stochastic objects versus indigenous objects or non-objects. But I was wondering, going back to something that Ivan said about the sort of states of matter, and we're talking a lot about solid states and conserving, but there's sort of fluidity, and like materials, some
Is that a
Yeah,
question?
I don't feel like I can answer that question. I'm not the
No,
user, yeah.
on this one,
Yeah.
I would like to come back to one of Peter Miller's
Sure.
questions if there's time, but maybe on this immediate one, somebody else might wish to say something. No,
I can only talk
Yeah.
from the museum perspective. So in my experience, when a museum acquires an ephemeral work of art, a performative work of art, a variable work of art, then the museum needs to acquire an understanding of that variability and document what it is and what it can be. As I think I mentioned last night, we discussed it last night, develop the identity of the core essence of the work as constructed by the artist, if it's a contemporary work, so that the museum can manage its change. If it's not within a museum, then it belongs to presumably whoever created it, or whoever owns it, and so it's a very different kind of negotiation. I always like to say that when an object enters the museum, the people, the decision makers around that object change, and the person who created the object's relationship legally changes as well. So, I don't know if that helps you, but it's all about documentation within the museums for performance art, for instance.
Justin, do you want to go back to one of these?
Yeah,
larger questions?
perhaps I could come back to Peter Miller's question about time. I'm thinking, up to a point, perhaps what you're inviting us to think about is simply time. Is it a short period of degradation, or is it a very fast period of degradation, or is it a relatively extended period of degradation? And one thinks with a very sudden degradation, then it's something that one surely ought to do something to try to arrest. And with the very long ones, one might just have to reconcile oneself to, they're just not going to be stoppable. I don't know. It seems to me that, what I find myself quite often coming back to is it can't be called a parallel, but the comparison with the situation of a living organism, an animal that will age, that isn't going to last forever. And you can think of, so to speak, accelerated aging and disease as things that one would wish to intervene on, and which, to every extent that one can, one sort of does find that doctors get out there to try to intervene on. And yet there are other things that, in the end, just in principle, one has to reconcile oneself to being inevitable. And some of them are internal, that, I don't know, there can be, things that can be called genetic defects, things of disease. And then there are cases of environmental impact. And in both of those cases, one can say, if only one can intervene to reduce the effect of the environmental damage, or instead, in the case of something made of these acetates, which is going to fall to pieces, here there's a question. You raised the question yesterday. Is this, so to speak, something the artist would never have wanted to happen? And the artist would have, and then one can think, yes, if there was some really quite minor intervention, put this in a gas environment and heat it to 47 degrees, and it's all going to become it won't self-destruct in that circumstance. The thing is, the interventions are probably not that simple, I guess.
There's no reversing of yellow.
There's no reversing.
Well, another thought on time is maybe we need to understand objects as moving through time and place, and that as active matter, physically changes in response to environments, maybe we need to understand objects in all of its past incarnations, including its original creation, say, by the artist or the culture who produced it. And so maybe we need to have a larger understanding of the object as its pasts and its presents and its futures in terms of its conservation. Is that close to what you're getting at, or you?
I think that is where I'm getting at, because if we sort consider that the brass ring, so to speak, is, if Robert were here, he would say, the conservator as a kind of new kind of intellectual for the future. What are the kinds of intellectual capacities that need to be developed, right? And it seems to me that the level at which time is discussed by conservators is not up to the challenge of these new materials, right? With some exceptions.
Yeah, can I invoke Robert again?
Yeah.
Because he's really effective with fundraising, let's put that out there. But what he does with the Dutch government is he presents this case, and it's that, okay, we have the Night Watch, this iconic painting. How long do you want it to last? And he puts an economic value on being able to preserve this iconic work of art going forward for, what, 100 years, 1,000 years? What do you guys want for this to survive? And that sets up an entire framework for us to do our investigations to try to figure out how to invest it with that intellectual curiosity and to build the field into a place where we can actually start to answer that question about the serviceable lifetime of a painting.
But in fact, if we sort of think about Robert's trick, right, it does raise another area for us to think about, which has come up, and Justin just did it, and that is, do we need to think more about the not just the parallel, but the way we can learn back and forth from the lives of people to the lives of objects, and take our frame of reference, and which frame of reference do we want? Immortality? Do we want immortality for ourselves and therefore for the Night Watch? Or do we say we can't have it for ourselves and therefore we want it for the Night Watch? Or do we say we can't have it at all, become Buddhists and let it deteriorate? These are really huge questions, right?
Absolutely. Fundamental.
Well, that's something I thought about today too when we were kind of going through different parts of history of like how objects were cared for and what are our societal values now that we can sit here and have this conversation and we can talk about these amazing technologies we have to do non-invasive studies and those are part of development of technology, but also questions that people are able to ask because of the societal environment that they're in. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. In 150 years, what will the attitude be and where will we be then? Go ahead.
Can I raise a new question? Because it's the perfect form to ask it. Abby, this morning told about Bild with filtering being completely analyzed, non-invasive first. And this has been happening for some time now, that the conservator is becoming what the curator was, I think, a new artist in a way. And there is a spectacle of conservation. It's made visible, there are movies about it, and it's becoming a commodity of museums. And on the one hand, that's wonderful because it will educate a lot of people about materials. And on the other hand, I sometimes wonder in how much will that cover up a lot of the critical discourses that Glenn just said we should be having, with a lot of people critically discussing what is going on. And I was just curious about the opinions of the conservators at the table who might, you also, who were engaging in these projects, what do you think about this? I mean, how far does your freedom go in saying, I want to show this, and what is the institution saying, what will we show about conservation?
Could you clarify what you're asking? Are you suggesting that conservation is being promoted as a science to the sort of which overrides other ways of understanding?
Live showing what is going on, the making of, the glimpse behind the scenes that's commodified by in a mediatized fashion. So it answers to this idea of the making of. Look, we are offering you and showing you what's really happening in the museum. And I was just wondering how the museum feels about that. Is this really what's going on?
So the implication is that conservation is being promoted as a science, and then what's missing is the negotiation of meaning.
Maybe.
Or, yeah.
Or as a spectacle.
As a spectacle.
As a spectacle.
Yeah.
Conservation is promoted as a spectacle.
Okay.
Well, we've long talked around the cultures of conservation about the kind of pop culture interest in forensics
Yeah.
and, you know, the kind of CSI level
Yeah.
interest.
We're
I think
always
that's
talking
what you're
about
talking about in part.
Somebody bring, yeah, we're always talking about bringing somebody who's doing forensics.
You find the right tool and the answers are laid bare.
Here's a conservator.
I think the most commonly used trope we use to describe conservation to a lay audience is that we're doctors for art, and that really misses the mark. And it's a false analogy, and it really perpetuates a lot of these sort of ideas. And you know, there's been a change over the course of the 20th century in changing the humanizing, paternalistic attitude of doctors toward their patients. This is the same sort of thing that we see in our world, but we're also the kind of doctors like plastic surgeons, and if we do our work well, you'll never know. So how can conservators be transparent about what we do while still claiming that it's the very absence of the traces of our work that makes our work valuable? So I think, I mean, the Leonardo that came out just recently, if people don't know how much restoration goes on to every painting in the world, how will they understand the value of investing in our work? So conservators have moved, I think, smartly towards publicizing our analysis, publicizing our research, publicizing the things that we think have credibility in the world, but that don't detract from the mystery of and the magic of what we do that is the sleight of hand. So being in between these different worlds, I think we're in a position of trying to appeal to audiences in disparate ways, and in fact negating both sides of it. You can't have it really both ways.
So there's one other aspect to it, which I think is a really important one, and that is the way that we look at art. When you enter into a gallery, you're standing apart from the art, and you're not entering into its psychological orbit. And when you're having a conservator actually physically working on it, you're breaking that orbit, you're making it more accessible so people can actually approach it and be part of it. And I think that that's why the public is so enamored of it, because you get to see the art as something that's tangible and real instead of it being something apart from your everyday experience.
That's exactly right. The both sides that you were just.
Go ahead.
May I continue on this question and say that I think I definitely respect conservation and restoration process itself and the beauty and scientific approach that is applied. But I think this showing off technology is not only just saying, look what we can see using these new tools, but it's also going into a cultural value of the results that we are able to acquire, and it's a storytelling that doesn't mean only protecting, carrying the specific work of art, but build a new knowledge about that specific technology or technique, or information that can be used in many different dimensions to tell the story that is new, let's say innovative, and I definitely think Mark hit the spot with these three different dimensions that can be explored just by applying the tools that we can access now in kind of a systematic way. And I think this could be an additional value to all of the let's say collections that we have now promoted through traditional 20th century exposition and protection, but it opens a new opportunity to show that beyond visible. It's very kind of overused term, but in my opinion opens a great opportunity to bring museums into a new space. A new space, in my opinion, does go along the digital world and access of the information worldwide to big public, and that shift, that maybe this is the right place to talk about it, that the paradigm shift of protecting it through the entrance into a museum and exposing your collection to in a new space through tools that one could define and standardize, could be a new dimension of making additional value, but also telling the story, new stories about what we have there.
Yeah, so this feels very unsatisfactory to stop right here as a formal kind of end to our discussion today. I want to say thank you all for being here and for coming near and far and being engaged in this discussion. And please don't go away because this is going to keep happening. But can we first, I'm going to let Peter say a couple words.
Well, I'm just gonna, I mean, I only have like enough voice for a couple words.
Yeah.
So just to echo what Alicia said, to have you here, but also to say that it's not, we're just taking a slight break, that those are the sort of the invited participants are invited to go upstairs for a working dinner. So I think the tables should be set upstairs like this, not like they were at lunch, and we can actually continue the conversation with the most important ingredient and fuel of all, in red and in white upstairs. Thank you.
Yeah,
Working
thank you.
dinner, I will not.